right now. Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to Bellarmine Chapel. My name's Tim Severin. I'm the Director of Social Mission here at the chapel. For the past 2 years, our community has been participating in a campaign called Share the Journey. It was launched by Pope Francis with the idea that churches around the globe should walk with migrants and refugees. So we've been trying to do that in a number of different ways. The biggest, which many of you are familiar with, has been hosting a family of asylum seekers from El Salvador, the Merche family. And for those of us who've worked closely with them, we've started to realize just how very, very complicated the immigration system is and the many obstacles and difficulties people face within it. So tonight we invited Allison Herre, an attorney and the Director of Immigration Legal Services for Catholic Charities, to explain the system to us, to answer our questions, and to give us some tips on how we might be advocates within it or help people to have their rights honored within the system. Before we begin, I want to open us with a prayer. You might have grabbed it as you came in. We can read it all together. It says, "Let us share the journey" at the top. This is the official prayer of the campaign. Adonai, Lord and Master, many are the journeys your people have taken. Abraham's journey led from fear to understanding. Moses' journey led from bondage to liberty. The disciples' journey led from death to new life. Even today, your people journey, immigrants and refugees, pilgrims and nomads, searching for hope, searching for opportunity, searching for you. Lord, I know that I too am called to journey. Continue to call me beyond my comfort and into encounter. And when I meet a companion on the road, may we find you in each other's embrace. Let us share the journey. Amen. So you will have 2 other handouts that Allison will be referencing. If you didn't grab them, they are on a table out there. You should grab them. And with that, I will invite you up. Thank you for being with us, Allison.
We're a smaller group. Can everyone hear me if I talk loudly? Or do you want my microphone? Microphone? Okay. I don't like hearing my voice, so that's why I'm a little hesitant to use it. Okay. As Tim mentioned, I am an immigration attorney. I am also the director for the Immigration Legal Services Department at Catholic Charities of Southwestern Ohio. Catholic Charities in Ohio is the largest provider of services to immigrants coming to the U.S. as refugees. Cincinnati area, the Catholic Charities in Cincinnati, that's the only resettlement agency in our area. Because of that, and because of our connection with the Sukasa Hispanic Center, we provide a very wide range of services to immigrant and refugee families. My department in particular provides services in the legal context. So we represent immigrants and refugees on immigration-related cases. So that runs the gamut between family-based applications for green cards and visas, naturalization. We also do removal defense cases and humanitarian cases. And tonight you're going to hear all about the different types of benefits there are in the immigration system. Because we have a lot of time, and my presentation can get kind of confusing sometimes, I'm going to let people ask questions during the presentation. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand, speak loudly so everyone can hear you, and then I will hopefully be able to answer your question. Okay. So I like to give people kind of an idea of the pathway we're going to take on presentations, and this is the outline of what we're going to talk about tonight. First, I'm going to give you some information on the immigration terminology. So different things that you might hear about in media or online, we're going to talk about what they mean in the legal context. I'm also going to give you a little bit of an overview, not a detailed explanation of every single step, but a very brief overview of the different pathways that a person who is not born in the United States can take to get permanent status, which is also known as a green card. And then there are a couple of special topics that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the border, asylum seekers at the border, and then we're also going to talk a little bit about rights, constitutional rights that people have in the United States that are available in order to protect people from infringements of their liberties by the government. So we're going to talk about that, and I've got a really fun video to show you about someone who actually used the Know Your Rights training that he went through in a real-life situation with real-life ICE officers. Some of you probably are familiar with the story, but we'll get into it a little bit more later on. All right. So first we're going to talk about the really boring stuff that I find really fascinating and really exciting, but it's also very complex and confusing. We're going to talk about the different categories of statuses in the United States. And you'll notice on the screen there is a triangle, an inverted triangle, and that's kind of our immigration and legal and political and social system in the United States. That's what that's supposed to represent. And then you can see across the middle of that, there's this bright red bold line. That line has two purposes. The first is to separate those temporary statuses down at the bottom from the permanent statuses at the top of the triangle. The other thing that it shows you, besides the fact that there is a separation between permanent and temporary statuses, is that there's no direct pathway from those temporary statuses up into the permanent statuses. By that I mean, someone who comes here on a temporary visa or for temporary purpose cannot, by virtue of being here on that temporary visa or that for that temporary purpose, can become a green card holder, okay? There may be other ways that they can qualify for a green card, and we'll talk about those, but there's a very clear, bold line between those two areas of immigration law to kind of solidify in everyone's minds that there's no direct pathway from a temporary status at the bottom into those permanent statuses at the top. All right, so we're going to go into a little bit of U.S. civics here for a minute, and the first status we're going to talk about are U.S. citizens. Does anyone know one of the three ways that a person can become a U.S. citizen? Birth in the United States. So in the Constitution, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says that if you are born in the territories or the soil of the United States, you are automatically, by virtue of having been born here, a citizen. Right. A second way that you can become a U.S. citizen. Yes?
If you have American citizens as parents, but you're born outside the state.
That is a great one. People never get that one. That's true. Okay, so what she said, it's called derivation and acquisition. It's kind of like a A and B of number two. And essentially it's foreign people who are born outside of the United States but are born to U.S. citizen parents are automatically, by virtue of being born to a U.S. citizen parent, a U.S. citizen. Now the U.S. citizen parent has to actually go to the consulate and register the birth, but that child will automatically receive citizenship from their parent. And then acquisition is if a person who becomes a U.S. citizen, this is the third way to become a U.S. citizen, is by application. A person who becomes a U.S. citizen after they already have children, if those children are under the age of 18, when their parent becomes a citizen of the United States, that child automatically derives citizenship from their parent, which is, I think, a really interesting way that people can become U.S. citizens. And then, like I said, the third way is by application. In order to apply to be a U.S. citizen, a person first has to be a permanent resident. And they have to be a permanent resident for 5 years or 3 years if they're married to a U.S. citizen. So a lawful permanent resident is someone who has a green card. That's what people in the common vernacular refer to this category of statuses. And a green card is acquired through a couple of different ways, and we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the pathways you can get a green card. But it's very important to understand that a permanent resident is someone who has permission from our government to stay in the United States permanently, to work anywhere they want to in the U.S., except for some government jobs, for some security reasons. And they can leave the United States and come back without having to get prior permission to come into the U.S. That's very different than anyone else below them. So that's one of the nice things about being a permanent resident is that it's very similar to being a U.S. citizen. There are two things that permanent residents cannot do that U.S. citizens are privileged enough to be able to do. Does anyone have an idea of one of the two things that a permanent resident cannot do? Vote, yes, vote in federal or state elections, depending on the state. Some states do allow for permanent residents to vote. And then the second thing, most people don't think about this one, serve on a jury, yay! Wow, has anyone been to this presentation before? Because you guys are like on top of these answers. No? Okay. Yep, so those are the two things that a permanent resident cannot do that a U.S. citizen can do: vote and serve on a jury. And then refugees and asylees. And the legal definition of these two groups is the same, which is why they're grouped together. But there is a difference between them, and I'll give it to you after I tell you the definition. The definition of a refugee and asylee is someone who is fleeing persecution or has a well-founded fear of persecution in their home country on account of one of 5 protected grounds. Those 5 protected grounds are race, religion, national origin, particular social group, and political opinion. Okay? So unless you can prove to the satisfaction of our government that you are going to be injured or killed or violated in some way because of your race, religion, national origin, particular social group, or political opinion, you're not going to get asylum. Only about 40% of applications for asylum get approved. Okay? So the difference between a refugee and asylee, is that what your question was going to be? Or?
I was going to ask, how do you define the social group?
Oh, okay. So the Board of Immigration Appeals and the circuit courts say that a particular social group has to have 3 things. It has to be definable, okay? Everyone in the group has to share immutable characteristics. They all have to be like generally the same type of person in that group. The characteristics themselves cannot be easily changed. So race, gender, sexual orientation, family relationship, those are kinds of areas where we can get particular social groups. And then the other thing is that they have to be socially distinct or socially visible, meaning that everyone else in the society recognizes this group as being an actual group. So it's very complicated, it's very difficult. For a number of years, up until about last March, April or March last year, people who are victims, women who are victims of domestic violence in their home countries, especially in countries that have a very strong patriarchal society or machismo society, they were able to get asylum based upon the particular social group. Unfortunately, last year, the government changed its understanding of what a particular social group is, and now domestic violence victims, it's not an easy road for them anymore, as it used to be. Yeah?
Did you say religious persecution is one of the grounds?
Yes, religion is one of the 5. So race, religion, national origin, which can be tribal group too, so people coming from Africa that have, conflict within their country, but maybe are born in that country, but based upon their tribal background are persecuted, they fall into that category. Particular social group and political opinion. Yeah.
We've seen cities in the Middle East that are just having the hell bombed out of them, and whoever you are, if you're living there, your house is likely to be destroyed when people walk across the border. They are refugees, but they don't meet any of your status here.
So technically, yes, they do, because of their political opinion. So when they go to refugees and asylees, let me tell you what the difference is between these two really quickly so that you can kind of understand a little bit more where I'm going with your answer. Refugees are people who are outside of the United States and fleeing persecution in their home country and go to the UN High Commission on Refugees, or UNHCR, and ask for protection from getting sent back to their home country. UNHCR spends 2 years vetting these people, going through their asylum application. And by the way, our definition of asylum, our definition of refugee is almost verbatim the UN's understanding of what a refugee is. Now, the definition may be the same, our understanding of how we apply that definition's a little bit different in some contexts, but for the most part, if the UN says they're a refugee, then we will probably also say that they are a refugee. Now, in order for them to get through the refugee process, they have to first go to UNHCR, then UN sends them to a designated safe resettlement country. That's how we get them. Then our U.S. government, the State Department, and the Department of Homeland Security both go out to the camps and interview people, do their own background checks. That takes another 4 to 6 years in some instances. So refugees are designated as being in need of protection before they come to the U.S. Asylees come to the U.S. first. So people coming up from Central America, South America, fleeing gang violence, domestic violence, political crises in their own countries, they're fleeing and coming to the U.S. first and claiming asylum. And so they have to show to the government's satisfaction here that they meet those criteria. Now, for people who are coming from Syria, a lot of them are fleeing the civil war on account of opposition to that government. And even if they were to go back to Syria and try to reestablish their lives now that the civil war has kind of wound down a little bit, they are probably still going to be targeted by that government because they were, or potentially would have had some political opposition or political affiliations that were contrary to the government. And that's why the people coming from Syria, whenever there's a civil war, and especially when people who are coming from the losing side are fleeing, they're going to be able to get refugee status because of political opinion. Yep.
But if my neighbour has the opposite political opinion, but his house is still being bombed to hell, his position is really the same. You're saying, do they ask a test of political opinion from that president? Yeah, he's okay, I'm not having you.
Yes, that's exactly what would happen in the camp. They would ask them, what do you think would happen to you if you went back to Syria? Why do you think the government would be targeting you as opposed to your neighbor or the person down the street from you? And that's why they're able to raise the claim of asylum. Yeah.
And to further complicate, if I understand rightly, when tides change and the faction that was granted status and they got green cards in the United States, all of a sudden their political party takes over that country. When they reapply for a green card, they may not get it renewed, right?
So technically the government could revoke refugee status. Our U.S. government could revoke refugee status for someone if the situation in their home country changed to an extent that allowed it to be safe for them to go home. The likelihood of that actually happening is pretty small unless that person decides to commit a crime in the U.S. or leaves the U.S. and goes back to the home country. Then the U.S. probably strip away their refugee status, but they're not looking as closely at those individual cases because we have a couple 100,000 refugees right now. Yeah.
I came here to try to get my mind a little bit more understanding of a very complicated issue. I didn't think I was going to be this confused.
Sorry.
No, it's not because of your explanation, it's because of the system, so I'm sorry to put it that way. But if I'm one of these Syrian folks, can I try to summarize where my head is at right now?
Okay.
I am in this group that has a different political opinion. I then have been determined through definitions of the UN that I am going to be part of this refugee group. The UN then determines, out of this 100,000 group of refugees, that the U.S., you have these 10,000. These 10,000 refugees then are being interviewed by the United States. And there is an individual person that is going to give a thumbs up or thumbs down based on that single interview as to whether they're determined to be a refugee in the United States.
Yes. Just to put into context everything you said, there's an estimated 25.4 million people living in refugee camps across the world. The U.S. accepts, so last year we had a cap of 45,000 and we actually admitted about less than 23,000 refugees. This year the cap is at 30 and we are on target to hit maybe 20. So we are actually the country that accepts the most refugees in the entire world. So putting into context how many people are probably not ever going to get out of a camp or not ever going to get to a safe third country, just kind of keep that in mind a little bit too because of how the magnitude of the problem.
So all
Yeah.
the refugees in the world, that's only about 1% that are getting relocated.
Oh, it's less than 1%. Yeah. Yeah. So can I move on to temporary statuses or you can talk to me afterwards too? Oh, yeah, sorry. I will start repeating the questions so people can hear. I apologize for that. Yeah.
I just want to go back a little bit before I go to the second line here about the lawful permanent resident.
Okay.
kind of criteria does it take to get a letter from the government that says you're a permanent resident?
Yeah, so I'm going to go over that. That's the next like 4 slides after we get here. I've got like 16 slides, and we're still on slide number 3. I didn't mean to like make this a, anyway. So temporary statuses, very quickly. Again, these are for people who are not born in the US, they're not permanent residents, they're not refugees, and they don't really have a direct pathway into getting into those areas. So the first one is the one that says non-immigrant visa. The reason I use that is because it's a legal term of art. Essentially what it means is that a person who has an immigrant intent has an intention to live permanently in the United States, and we do have what are called immigrant visas. That's how you get the green card. But the non-immigrant visas are for people who are coming to the US for a temporary purpose and for a temporary time frame. A very good example of that is a student. We're at a college campus. I am sure there are students here that have the F1 student visa. It is when a person who wants to come and study in the US gets enrolled in school, they have to show to the US government satisfaction that they have enough resources and funds to support themselves, not only while they're here, but also to pay for their education in the US. They have to go through a background check and a vetting process before they actually are issued the visa and their passport. And then when they come into the US, they're allowed to stay for the duration of their education program. And then when that education program ends, they have to go back home. So that's why I say there's no direct pathway from student visa or non-immigrant visa up into a permanent visa. There's no, like you're not here on a student visa and then you can automatically get a green card. Just one second, okay? The other thing about student visas, and a lot of the other non-immigrant visas that we have available in the US, is that you cannot work in the United States. Unless you get special permission, or unless it actually pertains directly to the program you're engaged in, you cannot work while you're here on a student visa. There are a couple of work visas that are temporary work visas that are issued for 3-year or sometimes 2-year periods, but they're limited to working for a particular employer. In a particular field, in a particular job. So it's very restricted what the immigrant can do while they're here on a non-immigrant visa. Someone who decides to come to the US on a non-immigrant visa, I'm gonna get to you in just one second. Did you still have a question? Okay, cool. I answered it, yes. A person who comes here on a non-immigrant visa and then falls out of status, maybe they have decided to start working and they weren't given work authorization, or they were told to leave by January 1st, 2019, and look, we're in April and they're still here, they're overstaying their visa. They fall down, and I'm dropping down below deferred action for a minute, because if you understand what an undocumented person is, it's easier to understand a deferred action. So they fall into a non-documented or an undocumented status. In common rhetoric on media and television, a lot of people will refer to this group of people as illegal aliens or illegal immigrants. I feel like that detracts from the person's humanity, and so as an immigrant advocate, I refer to them as undocumented people. For our discussion tonight, also please, I ask that you respect their dignity and refer to them as undocumented people. But they're people who have no status, no documentation, if you will, in the United States. They can't get work authorization. They cannot travel without being able to come back and be able to come back into the U.S. And it's, you know, a lot of them are living in shadows, right? So, and I already mentioned that one way to become undocumented is by coming here on a visa and then overstaying or violating the terms of your visa. There's a second way to be an undocumented person. Does anyone have an idea of what that would be? Sneak in? Yes, I'm not sure I would use that phraseology, but someone who comes across the border without prior permission, who enters unlawfully, is also considered undocumented. Now, between those two groups, who thinks that there are more undocumented people in the US that came across the border without permission or snuck across the border? More than the other group, the people who overstayed visas. Yeah, okay. So actually, the overstays, there's about 40% of the population, of the undocumented population, are visa overstayers. That is actually flipping right now. So the Center for Migration Studies, which is an organization funded and I think mostly organized by the US Conference of Catholic Bishops, they put out a study this year saying that last year, There were about 300,000 people arrested at the border for trying to cross the U.S. into the U.S. without prior permission. But there were about 600,000 people who overstayed their visas. So there's a kind of a shift in where the undocumented population is coming from. So now we're going to talk about deferred action. Deferred action is kind of like a catch-all. There are a bunch of different programs that are available. Some of them are enacted by the executive branch. Some of them have been enacted by Congress. But they all have the same basic principle of trying to effectively use the government's resources. Right? So there are people in the United States. We have an estimated 12 million people who are undocumented in the U.S. And it would be a huge strain on the government's resources to go after every single person who was undocumented. And so the government has created some programs to protect people who would not be able to get status otherwise. So a very common example in the current modern vernacular is DACA, which stands for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It was a program created by the Obama administration in 2012 in order to give work authorization and kind of a promise against enforcement against children who were brought to the U.S., went to high school in the U.S. or got a GED, don't have a criminal record, and just want to work and support their families. There are a couple of other programs as well. Another one that's kind of getting a little bit more common in public discourse is TPS, or Temporary Protected Status. That program was created by Congress and designated to or delegated to the executive branch powers of selecting countries, or if there's like a country that's going through a natural or human disaster, and there are people from those countries in the United States now, the U.S. government can designate people from those countries to receive protection from getting sent back to those countries because of how bad the situation is in their home country. So a lot of the countries are from Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Haiti, the Sudan. I'm sorry? Guatemala does not have TPS designation. Yeah. But essentially they were created in order to help people stay safe in the temporary period of a disaster or economic crisis in their home country. Okay, so you all kind of picked up this sheet. I'm getting to, sir, your question here about how do you get a green card? This chart shows you two of the main areas that green cards are available for people. The first one, so I'm not going to go through every single step in this. This is for you to take home and peruse at your leisure. But some things I'd like to point out about this is this little guy up here, he's our immigrant going through the process. He's got nice coiffed hair, cute little mustache, he's got nice clothes on, and he wants to go through this door to become a U.S. citizen. Now, you can see him again at the end of the process, where I guess he hasn't cut his hair or shaved his beard at all because he's got really long hair. And this kind of is supposed to show how long it takes to actually get status in the US. And these are two of the main ways that you can become a permanent resident. The first one relates to the blue column at the top and then the green column at the top. This is through family members. So the blue column is US citizen family members. The green are lawful permanent resident or green card family members. And then down here, we've got the different ways that someone can get status through an employer. But you can see there's these red boxes with no next to it. Those are the instances where this person is not going to be able to get a green card through that pathway. And there are 7 of them on this chart. There are more ways as well, but this is just 7 of them. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about U.S. Green cards through the employment context and through the family-based context. In both situations, the immigrant, the foreign national, needs to have a U.S. sponsor. And the U.S. sponsor in employment is going to be a business or a university. Hospitals apply for green cards for employees as well. The person who is getting the green card, the employee, has to be, so there's a preference for highly skilled and well-educated people. I'll show you the chart of what all the different categories are for employment-based status. The government caps how many green cards are issued in these categories every year at 140,000. There are far more applications submitted on an annual basis than 140,000. So what happens is that because there are only so many available, the government issues you what's called a priority date, or your get in line ticket. And when that becomes current, when your date is called up, then you can get your green card. And there's a chart in the next couple of slides that'll show you how long it takes to get the green card. But you can see there are some knockout factors to getting a green card through an employer. Criminal history is definitely going to knock you out. Having a history of immigration violations, so sneaking across the border. Having communicable diseases, mostly the government's concerned about tuberculosis right now and gonorrhea for some reason. And then public charge. And public charge refers to people who are going to become primarily dependent on the government for assistance. So that will knock you out of getting a green card in both the employment context and the family-based context. For family, as you kind of saw in that chart, there are two types of relationships that you can have. One is to a U.S. citizen, and the other one is to a permanent resident. And either of those anchors, we'll say, can sponsor an immigrant to come to the U.S. But there are only certain familial relationships that qualify, and I'm going to go over those too. You'll see a little bit more clearly in the next couple of slides what I mean by the number available in the family context, because you see there's something called an immediate relative, and there's no cap to those. Those are only reserved for people whose anchor person in the U.S. is a U.S. citizen, and it's only for certain relationships to a U.S. citizen. For everyone else who's coming to the U.S. With a family member trying to come into the U.S. as the relative of a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, the government only issues 226,000 visas or green cards every year. And because there are far more applications in the family context than there are in the employment context, and far more than the 226 that are available every year, the government has, again, this waiting line, and people have to wait, and I'll show you in a minute how long some people have to wait to get their green card. All right, so this is the waiting list, or about how long, the estimated wait times for people who are trying to get a green card through an employer. And you can see over here, the visa categories are listed. So the top ones that take the least amount of time are people with extraordinary abilities. So Justin Bieber, I'm not sure I would really call him extraordinary ability, but like he's Canadian, right? So he could potentially get a green card by having what's considered extraordinary ability if you're a 16-year-old girl. Outstanding professors and researchers, and this isn't just like someone who's a brand new student who gets out of grad school with their PhD and wants to start teaching. This person has to show that they've done research, that they are well written, that they are recognized as being outstanding in their field. You can also see there are a couple of categories for skilled workers and people with advanced degrees. These are bachelor's degree and higher, essentially. There are categories for special immigrants, and these are kind of the humanitarian ones. I'm not sure why they lumped it in with the family stuff or the business stuff, but essentially these special immigrants are kind of a humanitarian-based process to get a green card. And then the employment creators, those are essentially people who are buying their visa for about $1 million and are going to create jobs in the U.S. And then we've got the family side. So remember I said there were immediate relatives and they don't have a cap to the number of visas issued every year. That's this gold box up here. And you can see it's spouses, children, and parents of a U.S. citizen. Now, for children, the child has to be unmarried and under the age of 21 in order to qualify as an immediate relative to a U.S. citizen. For parents, the U.S. citizen who is applying for their mom or their dad has to be 21 years of age or older. So a baby who is brand new in the world cannot file an application for his mom until he's 21 at least. And then everything else down here, these are all the capped ones. These are the ones that are limited to the 226 every year. 26,000, sorry. So you can see there are U.S. citizens, relatives that are lumped in here. There's sons and daughters of U.S. citizens who are unmarried. There are married sons and daughters of U.S. citizens, and there are also siblings of U.S. citizens. And then for permanent residents or green card holders, they can apply for their spouses and their minor children, and they can also apply for their unmarried children who are over the age of 21. This over here gives you an idea of how long it actually takes to get the green card through that process. And you can see a child of a US citizen who is married is going to have to wait between 12 and 58 years to get their green card. Two really fun facts about immigrant visas and the green cards through family members is that they are not inheritable and they're not transferable. What do I mean by that? So if the US-based sponsor, the permanent resident or the US citizen dies, that application dies with them. If the child or relative, the foreign national relative, dies, the application dies, which makes sense, right? But if we're talking about a married child of a US citizen, who are they going to bring to the US with them? Their spouse, their children probably, and that spouse or child cannot benefit from a visa if the anchor person dies. So people who are waiting 12 to 58 years probably aren't ever going to see their green card. Yes?
And the length of time is because of the quota that's making this so long.
Yes, the question was, the length of time is directly related to the quota system. Yes. The answer is yes. Any other questions about the wait times? If you Google Visa Bulletin, you will see every month the US Department of State issues a new list of what dates they're issuing visas for. And I showed you the time frame, but if you look at the list online, it'll say applicants before, so for the family-based married sons and daughters of US citizens, applications received before 1994, I think it's like maybe March 1994 right now in that category for Mexico. That doesn't necessarily mean that everyone else who filed after that date is only going to have to wait 20 years because there are so many extra visas applications out there still pending and only so many visas available. So it's kind of it's misleading to look at the Visa Bulletin. All right, the third way, yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah.
I'm surprised at the multiplier in terms of some people that file, but then 3 times as long for 15, or even some of them are even more, 5 to 22. How do you explain that?
Yeah, okay. So if you look at the Visa Bulletin, it will actually, instead of it just saying the priority date and the category, it'll actually say different countries on it too. And the government has decided, because we've gotten so many applications from Mexico and so many applications from China and the Philippines and India, that we want to be fair to the rest of the world. Go figure. And so we'll limit the number of visas actually issued to people applying from Mexico or China or the Philippines. And so they're waiting even longer than people who are considered all other countries. So Canada, the United Kingdom, yes.
Are there financial expenses for the green card once you make your application?
So the question was, are there financial obligations that you have to continue paying into while you're waiting for the green card? The answer is no, but sort of. So the green card application takes 2 steps. Going through this process takes 2 steps. The first step, you pay the filing fee with the government once your petition gets approved. Then you're waiting for your visa. And then when your visa is available, when it's actually like ready to be issued to you, then there's another process you have to go through with the US State Department overseas if the person is outside the country, or if they're in the US, they also have to apply for the green card in the United States. And there's another fee. You have to do medical exams, background checks, all these extra things that have to happen, and an interview on top of all of that that happens at that last stage. So you may file your application back in 1994, and maybe the filing fee was like $120. But now when you actually apply for the visa, your visa is going to cost you $265 plus another $165 on top of that for your green card. And then you also have to pay for the medical exam, which is about $200 depending on where you're doing it. So, you know, even if you start your process at one point, the cost may be significantly different at the end point. Yes?
With spouses, it seems to me that there would be a real demand for
Okay, so the question was, and I think you were relating it particularly to people who are undocumented, and that since there's not a super long wait time for spouses of U.S. citizens, they might try to find a U.S. citizen to get married to. I would like to point out, right here, these knockout factors are going to make it really difficult. Having a history of immigration law violations, if you're undocumented in the United States, there aren't very many waivers available for that. And so even if you do find that U.S. citizen and they're the love of your life and you want to settle down and get married, if you are undocumented, you have a much higher hill to climb up.
So what are have a tourist visa? Find spouses.
The U.S. government also has protections against that. The first one is called sham marriage. And so they will vet the person very stringently. Like, you have to submit financial records, property, titles to property, insurance records, all these things to show that you're in a bona fide marriage. That's the legal term of art, meaning a real marriage. And then there's also a 30-day rule. So if you come into the U.S. on a visitor visa, you're allowed to stay for 6 months. That's how long you can stay on a visitor visa. If you get married within the first 30 days that you're here in the U.S., that's an automatic, irrebuttable presumption of a sham marriage, and you are kicked out of the U.S. If you are waiting and you're not so antsy to get married and you wait until like 30 to 60 days, there's a rebuttable presumption that you've committed fraud. And you can show to the government, no, I really didn't. When I came to the U.S., I really did mean to just stay here for a temporary time, and then I met John, and he's wonderful, and I want to marry him, and I want to be with him. If you can show to the government's satisfaction that you did not commit fraud when you got married, then you might be okay. Past that 60 days, there's a little bit less of a consideration to how you entered the U.S. Yes?
One of the elements that you had on the preceding slides is public charge.
Yes. Right here.
Where are other countries having asset requirements for immigration? And to what extent does that go in here? In fact, some of us quite literally prevent anybody from doing it, and they're meant to do it. What happens here?
So I'll tell you what is going on currently, and then I can tell you a very small snippet about the actual proposed rule. So right now, if a foreign national can have a financial sponsor, someone who makes over 150% of the poverty line, that's willing and able to sign a document saying, yes, government, if they have to go on public assistance, I will pay for it. Then they can overcome the public charge burden. For someone who, so that's the current rule. Back in October, the U.S. government issued a proposed rule change. And there was a comment period that lasted until December of last year. We still have not gotten the final rule posted, so the snippet of information I'm going to give you may change, depending on what the government decides to do with the proposed rule. So the proposed rule says we're going to change the understanding of what a public charge is, and instead of looking at just that affidavit of support, the affidavit of relationship that you're submitting with your application from your sponsor who's saying, I'm going to help if you need help, we're also going to look at your education level and your work history and your age and your health and all these factors to determine if someone actually will or might need public assistance when they come to the U.S. So the affidavit's going to have less weight. Also, if people will become, so under the current rule, if someone were to become primarily dependent on public benefits in order to sustain themselves in the U.S., then that's the knockout. Now it's just minimally accessing public benefits. So in the United States, and most states have this, WIC is for women, infants, and children. It is a federally funded public benefit for women who are pregnant, and then after the first year, after birth, the first year of the child's life, these benefits help with buying formula and diapers and medical care for the child and the mother while she is pregnant. Immigrant women can access this program because the idea is that they're going to be giving birth to a U.S. citizen, and then the U.S. citizen will be eligible for benefits. So that potentially could impact a person's ability to get a green card if they access those benefits under the new rule, under the proposed rule change. So the question was, how much teeth do those affidavits have in the sponsors? And currently, I've only seen it enforced in the context of divorce. So, say for example, a U.S. citizen brings his or her wife or spouse to the United States and signs this affidavit, and then they decide things aren't working out, they want to get divorced. The state court can look at that document and say, oh, you know, under our typical rules in Ohio, we'd only issue this much money for alimony, but because of this document, we're actually going to enforce it at a higher level, and so you actually have to pay a higher amount of alimony. It's the only time I've actually seen it enforced, and again, it's with the context of the state government enforcing the federal contract. But it is not unheard of for the federal government, especially in the context of, so someone who, again in divorce context, if they have a child that needs to get public benefits, and the parent who has signed off on being a sponsor for the immigrant isn't paying their child support, that could be another avenue for the U.S. government to kind of get at the U.S. citizen or permanent resident to pay the support or the benefits to the child. A lot of times it happens in when a child is receiving public benefits like Medicaid or food stamps and has a father listed on the application who is not in the child's life. So that's really the only time I've seen it enforced. Okay. All right, humanitarian pathways. We do a lot of this at Catholic Charities, and it's like, you thought the green cards through family members was complex. This stuff is like way worse. So I'm just going to give you a very brief information about the types of benefits that are considered humanitarian benefits. We've already talked about asylees and refugees at length, so I'm not going to say that again. But then there are two visas, and actually there's a third one that I didn't list in there that's also related to those two, and these are victims of crimes. A U visa is for people who are victims of certain types of crimes in the United States. So the crime actually has to happen here. And the person has to show that they've been helping law enforcement, either the police, the prosecutor's office, or a judge, in the investigation and prosecution of the crime. The way they show that is by getting law enforcement to sign off on a certificate saying that person is making themselves available, they've appeared in court, whatever the case may be. If you don't have that, you're not going to get a U visa. If you don't have that certificate from a law enforcement agency, you're not going to get a U visa. T visas are for people who have been victims of serious trafficking. Trafficking has really two definitions. One is labor trafficking, and that is when you are forcing an individual to work or denying, pay, or there sometimes has to be some sort of confinement involved in the trafficking scheme. But labor trafficking is also a crime. And we also will offer T visas to people who have been victims of labor trafficking. I think a lot of times, especially in the 75 corridor, we hear a lot about trafficking in the context of sex workers. And that's the secondary way that you can get a T visa, is by having been the victim of sex crimes or sex trafficking. And if you were under the age of 18, you don't even have to say that you went to police. You can just say, I was trafficked and I was 16 when it happened, and you can avoid the need of having a law enforcement certificate saying that you were helpful in an investigation. But for the most part, you have to show, if you are the victim of a crime, that you have been helping with an investigation. The theory behind these visas, and the reason that the government created these, the Congress created these visas, is to help law enforcement. Because, people who are living in an undocumented situation are very fearful of law enforcement. That makes them very vulnerable to crimes. And so by creating these visa programs, the government said, we don't want crime in our country at all. We want to protect everyone who's in the United States. It's a public safety issue for everyone if there is crime. And so we want to encourage people who are undocumented, who might not necessarily come forward on their own, to come forward and help eliminate the criminal elements of society. That's why these two visas were created. Getting on my soapbox for a second. The government last year, so if a T visa or a U visa prior to September of last year, if they were denied, the government said, no, it's not strong enough, you're missing a couple of things in your file, we're not going to grant the case, you're denied. Nothing would happen to the applicant unless they were committing crimes and suspected of committing terrorism or things like that. nothing would have happened to them. In September of last year, the government changed its policy, and anyone who is in the United States and subject to enforcement, deportation enforcement, who applies for a visa benefit that later gets denied is opening themselves up to, and the US government can put them into removal proceedings. So even though the government created this program to encourage people to come forward and report crime, thank you, the government is now saying, well, you know, you can report the crime, but we can also deport you at the end of it. Yes.
The safe harbor laws for trafficking only apply to certain ages, or would that be like, say if I'm here and I'm being trafficked for labor, and you're saying if I come forward and tell you about that, and I'm under the law, and I'm undocumented, I'm at risk,
Yeah. So the safe harbor rules, this is the question, if people didn't hear it. The question was essentially, would safe harbor protect someone who's being trafficked from being put into removal proceedings? That's kind of the gist I'm getting. Okay. Safe harbor laws are written by the state governments, for the most part. The US federal government doesn't need to listen to state governments, or so they say. And they do not apply in the context of removal proceedings. So safe harbor usually relates to, so like in the context of sex trafficking, a lot of times women who are being trafficked for commercial sex acts will also maybe have a couple of charges for prostitution, solicitation, things like that, because they're out in the community, they get picked up by law enforcement. And the safe harbor laws, the purpose of them is to kind of help those women who get out of the trafficking situation, especially if they do have prior criminal histories related to the trafficking, they can get those sealed and expunged, and so that they don't affect their ability to reintegrate into society. Because immigration law is considered administrative law, it's not criminal. Those safe harbor laws don't actually apply to the immigration code. Yeah.
You were saying this was a tweak to the law, and yesterday I heard that President Trump wants to charge a fee for asylums to do their applications. All these different tweaks, that's up to the executive branch after to do. Even though they might be laws, they might legislate.
Yeah. Okay, so the question for people in the back that couldn't hear, I had mentioned the tweak to the law, and I may have misspoke when I said that. It was a policy change. So laws are written by Congress. Laws can be changed by Congress. The executive branch writes regulations enforcing the law. They write policies enforcing the law. Under the U.S. Constitution and the Supreme Court's understanding of immigration law, Congress has what is known as plenary power, meaning unfettered or unrestricted powers when it comes to immigration. And what Congress has done over the years is delegate a lot of those powers to the executive branch, which has been used most notably by the current administration in all of the tweaks to the policies and the procedures and the regulations that have been coming out over the last couple of years. So yes, the executive branch, and there are some ways that attorneys are trying to combat this, mostly by filing suits under the Administrative Appeals Act. Essentially, there's a certain Administrative Procedures Act, the APA. There's certain ways that the government can implement and like go through the process of writing these new policies and procedures. And a lot of times, the only thing that attorneys or advocates can do is to fight the government on how they're implementing or how they're changing things, not necessarily on their ability or their power to change them. So call your congressman is my parting note on that. Special immigrants, very, very quickly, there's a whole gamut of them. Some of them are interpreters or translators that worked with the U.S. military in Afghanistan and Iraq during the war. Some of them are juveniles who have been abandoned, abused, neglected, or some similar reason under state law by their parents and cannot return home because of that. Some of them are religious workers, priests, religious sisters, ministers, those kinds of people are considered special immigrants. So that's another way you can get a green card. These are all ways you can get green cards. Again, very difficult if you are undocumented or here on a temporary status to get into any of those pathways. All right, very quickly on the border. December of last year, I went to Dilley, Texas, which is a town of about 5,000 people located in south central Texas, about an hour and 15 minutes south of San Antonio. It is where the U.S. government has the largest holding facility for women and children. And these are women and children who are recently arrived into the United States and seeking and asking for asylum protection. This facility holds 2,400 people. When I was there, they had about 2,000 women and children held at the facility. Advocates that go down and volunteer at this facility refer to it very lovingly as baby jail, because you will see children as young as 1 and 2 and 3 at the facility. And like I said, these people are very newly arrived into the U.S., and it's a very confusing and difficult time for them. So there are projects like the Dilley Pro Bono Project that help explain what's going on, help the women prepare for steps in their case that will help them get out of detention, get to family in the U.S., and hopefully be able to fight their immigration case. So I wanted to talk about the numbers of the borders for a very brief minute, because a lot of times when I do these presentations, a lot of people will have assumptions about what is going on at the border because of what happened in the past. In 2000, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol apprehended approximately 1.6 million people at the border. 1.6 million people. In 2016, we apprehended about 400,000. In 2017, which was the lowest since the 1970s, the lowest record was about just over 300,000 people were apprehended at the border. And you can see, so historically, people who were apprehended at the border were single adult males traveling maybe in groups or traveling, not as family units, but as people trying to find jobs. Unfortunately, I don't have anything older than 2013 because I don't think the government started tracking this until 2013. But you can see now the government has started tracking the number of unaccompanied immigrant children and the number of family units coming to the border. And there's been a very significant shift in this demographic that they're recording it now. In 2013, when they started recording family units, there were 13,000 family units apprehended at the border. Family unit means an adult parent with at least one minor child with them. And you can see year to date for 2019, fiscal year started October 1st for the U.S. government. So dating back to October 1st until March 31st of this year, the government has apprehended almost 190,000 women and children, or families with children. And you can see, compared to the number of adults who are coming into the U.S., single adults, that number has significantly dropped compared to the number of families and unaccompanied children who are coming into the U.S. Yeah?
These are the numbers apprehended.
Yes.
Now, when you compared them earlier with people overstaying visa, presumably we know that because you come in, you're given a visa, and then you can be seen leaving the country or not. You can be not seen to leave the country. Do we have any idea of how many coming to the southwestern border and not being apprehended?
They don't actually have record of that. And I would say probably, so I started working in immigration law in 2010 when I was still in law school, and I've been an immigration attorney since 2012. Since then, I don't think I've met a single person who has come past 2010 who made it across the border without some interaction with law enforcement at the border. So I think the numbers are very, very low. They also, the technology that's at the border is just out of this world right now. They've got drones, they've got, every inch of that border is monitored. The other thing that's not on this is that the country of origin is also shifting too. So historically, we were seeing lots of Mexican nationals, especially in the 2000s, the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s, because they were coming into work, right? Now we're seeing lots of Central Americans, and all of them are coming to the U.S., maybe I shouldn't say all of them. A majority of them, and the women and children that I met with when I was in Dilley, were coming to the U.S. because of fear, because of domestic violence, because of gang violence. Sometimes it's something as simple as a problem with their neighbor, but they're coming because they're afraid and they don't feel like their government is protecting them. Yeah, okay. So the women and children are fleeing gangs, domestic violence, and extreme poverty. To give you a little bit of context about how much it costs and what the journey is coming through Central America to come to the United States, 8,000 quetzales in the US is only about $1,000, which, you know, that's like a plane ticket, right? If you're paying a coyote, 8,000 quetzales, you're maybe buying a ticket to come to the US per person. But in Guatemala, I looked this up yesterday, if you were to buy a cheeseburger from McDonald's, 2 cheeseburgers per day from McDonald's, you could go 100 days before you actually run out of money on 8,000 quetzales. So you can feed yourself 2 hamburgers per day for 100 days on 8,000 quetzales in Guatemala. That's what people are coming from. That's the poverty that they're coming from. And burgers from McDonald's are a delicacy and a treat, right? Because, you know, they cost 40 quetzales. Yeah.
Do we know how many people, what the percentage of people who come guided by the coyote compared to those who come on their own or come in a group?
I don't know that they actually, U.S. government does not record that. They don't track that. From my experience in talking to people who have made the journey, most people come with a guide, with a guia, a coyote. It's becoming a little bit more common that people are coming in large groups. We saw at the end of last year the caravan of almost 7,000 people coming from Honduras. That's becoming more common, I think, because the cost of travel from Central America with a guia, with a coyote, is going up. Because, I mean, back in the early 2000s, you probably weren't paying 8,000 quetzales for your ticket to come to the U.S. with a coyote. It was probably closer to about 4,000. But this is getting to be a very lucrative business for people who are willing to make that trek multiple times. All right, so I don't even know what time it is. Are you guys bored? I'm sorry. Okay. How much time do we have, Tim? Oh, okay, cool. Yay. Does anyone have family members that are attorneys or like friends that are attorneys? Yes, yes. You'll know we like to hear the sound of our own voice. I'd like to think that I'm not like that, but I definitely am. All right.
Because you want to make sure that we understand.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to use that next time. Next time my mom tells me to stop talking. So, I told you a little teaser at the beginning. We're going to talk now about protecting your rights and people, the Know Your Rights presentations that I do in the community for immigrant communities. I've kind of tweaked it a little bit to use with non-immigrant communities or the immigrant ally communities because we got a lot of questions in the early 2017 regarding what can we do, how can we help, what can we do to walk with our immigrant brother and sisters. And this is kind of what I came up with is if you know your rights, you can share what those rights are with your friends, with your family members who are immigrants, who might be scared. And then, as we're going to see it in this clip, you can also use those rights to help protect someone. So, the U.S. Constitution is the highest law in the land. It says it in the Constitution. And because of that, all of our understanding of what the government can and cannot do is based in that document. Along with the Constitution, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights. And those are where our founders decided to outline in very general terms what the government can and cannot do, what would be an infringement of individuals' life or liberty. And the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted these amendments in ways that don't make sense to some people. But one thing that you need to know about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is that they apply to everyone in the United States. Regardless of your status, regardless of your origin of birth, these constitutional amendments, these constitutional rights are available to everyone in the U.S. And a couple of the important ones, especially when you're working with or interacting with law enforcement, is that you have a right against having an unreasonable search or seizure of yourself or your property. So a seizure is an arrest if you're a person, or it's like a confiscation of property if you are not a person, if it's property that we're talking about. You have a right to not incriminate yourself. You have a right to say, I'm not going to talk to you. You have a right to have an attorney with you if you're being arrested by law enforcement. And you have a right to language access. The Supreme Court has said, law enforcement agencies, if you're receiving any money from the federal government under Title IX, you are required to provide language access. So people who do not speak English as their first language do have the right to have the documents and the information provided to them in their own language. Now, when you're interacting with law enforcement, again, this applies to everyone in the United States. There are a couple of different types of interactions that you can have with law enforcement. You can see them listed right here on the far left. They're voluntary stop, a voluntary interaction, detention, and arrest. Detention is kind of a weird thing to talk about, especially when we're doing an immigration presentation, because people are detained by immigration, but they're actually held and not released, so it's more like an arrest, but it's not. Anyway, in every single one of these interactions with law enforcement, you have the right to remain silent. You don't have to say anything to the government if you don't want to. In Ohio, there's an exception. If you're stopped by law enforcement for either a detention, a temporary stop, or an arrest, you have to give the the law enforcement officer your name, your address, and your date of birth. Can anyone think of a document that you might hold in your wallet or your purse that has all three of those things on it? Your driver's license, yes, yeah. So if you provide your driver's license to law enforcement, you have completed that entire requirement under Ohio law. Now, does anyone have on their driver's license their place of birth or their immigration status? Yeah, I was born in St. Louis, Missouri. My driver's license does not say that I was born in St. Louis, Missouri. It just says my date of birth, my address, and my name. So law enforcement does not have a right to ask someone about their immigration status. I mean, they do all the time, but the person does not have to answer those questions, and that's where the right to remain silent comes into play. Law enforcement does not have the right to ask you what your immigration status is or where you come from or any of those kinds of questions, because all that is federal law. Local and state police are not here to enforce federal law. They do, a lot of times, but they're not supposed to. So the difference between a detention and an arrest is really how long it takes for that to finish. If you're stopped by police while you're driving, or stopped on the street because they see that you match the description of someone who was called in as being a robber, or committing a burglary or something along those lines, you're participating in a temporary voluntary conversation with law enforcement. It's called a detention. And it has to have a time frame attached to it. Usually the government says nothing more than 72 hours. So you can be taken away from the spot where you were, but you can't actually, well, okay. With a detention, you can't be taken away from the spot you are. So it's actually a much smaller period of time. But essentially, it's to give law enforcement the opportunity to ask you questions and to ascertain if you are the person who committed the crime or if you have committed a crime. And if they believe with reasonable certainty that you did commit a crime, then law enforcement has the authority to arrest you. And that's the third level down. You have the right to an attorney only when you've been arrested. So when you're stopped on the side of the street and law enforcement is asking you questions about why were you speeding? Are you drinking tonight? You don't have the right to have an attorney with you. You have the right to remain silent. Very, very important to remember if you ever stopped while maybe having had a couple of drinks, you have the right to remain silent. So in all those contexts, not only U.S. citizens have these rights, but also permanent residents, people who have visas, people who don't have visas, people who have deferred action, everyone. So when you're interacting with law enforcement, there are a couple of things you should not do. First thing is you don't run away. It seems like common knowledge, right? But coming from certain countries where law enforcement doesn't ask questions, they just shoot and then ask questions afterwards, A lot of times running is the safest option, but not here. Don't do that. Don't be rude, like they're doing a job, right? Sometimes they'll be rude to you. That's true. Maybe they're having a bad day, but in general, you can assert your rights without being disrespectful or being rude to a law enforcement officer. They don't like that. Don't provide false information or false documents. If you don't want to answer the question, don't answer it. But you have to say, I'm asserting my right to silence, just as a point of how you actually assert your rights, is you say, I'm not going to talk to you, I'm asserting my right to silence. Don't admit to doing anything wrong. Like, it's not your job to tell police what you did wrong. It's their job to figure out what you did wrong. And don't consent to a search. Unless the law enforcement officer has a warrant issued by a judge, you do not have to do anything except for sit there and wait for them to tell you to go. If you are with law enforcement and you're not sure what's going on, you're not sure which one of these you're in, ask the officer, am I free to go? The officer will tell you, no, I have a couple more questions. Well, then you say, well, okay, then what are you trying to ascertain, or what cause do you have to hold me here? You can ask them that. Why do you think that you have the right to hold me here? And if they don't really give you a good answer, then you can say, all right, well, I'm gonna go. If law enforcement says, yes, you're free to leave, because a lot of times they will say, no, I'm just like trying to ask you some questions, but you know, you're not forced to stay here if you don't want to, then calmly and slowly, not running, walk away. That's how you end that interaction. If the officer tells you, no, I'm gonna arrest you, they better be telling you your Miranda rights at the same time, in which they will tell you you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to have an attorney. If you don't have one, the government can appoint one for you. But if they're asking to look in the trunk of your car without a warrant, even if you don't have anything to hide, why give them the opportunity to look in your trunk? There are bad cops out there. I mean, who hasn't watched a Law & Order episode where a cop has planted evidence? Just don't give them an opportunity, right? All right, things to do when you're interacting with law enforcement. I already mentioned, be respectful, be nice, don't be rude. Give your name, address, date of birth. Provide a valid ID. Again, don't lie. If there's someone else around you, or if you can call someone, maybe it's late at night and you're getting stopped by law enforcement and you're a little worried about what might happen, you can call someone to come and sit with you. A lot of times, too, especially for people who don't have driver's licenses, if you can show the government, the law enforcement officer identification that has your name, your address, and your date of birth, if you have someone who's available to come take you away, like that you're not going to be driving away because you don't have a license, then the officer, more likely than not, is going to let you go. A lot of times when immigrants, especially, don't have driver's licenses and they're driving and they get stopped, even if they have identification to show, if they don't have anyone to come get them, the officer will say, oh, I'll just give you a ride down to the station. That's a bad idea. You don't never want to go to a station. So if you can have someone come and see what's going on, or maybe even record it, we're going to talk about that in a second, you should do that. Also, if you feel like the officer has abused you in any way, verbally, or emotionally, or if you feel like they're being unprofessional, law enforcement, actually, officers have told me this. Don't get their name, because that's not helpful. With Cincinnati Police Department, there are about 25 different John Smiths in the police department. So you want to get their badge number. It's listed on the shield that's on their chest. So you take that down, and if you have a complaint or believe that your rights were violated and you want to complain to the superior officer, that's how you make the complaint, is by knowing what the badge number is. And again, sometimes, like on Law & Order SVU, the cops will plant stuff, so don't believe everything that they say. All right. Okay. So with recording things in public, Ohio has this weird law requiring one party to consent to any interaction that's being recorded either by video, audio, or some other means. Basically, if you're in the public, campuses, for example, this is a really good example. If you're on a campus and you see something happening and you want to start recording it, you do have to get one party's consent in order for that to be disseminated to other people. If you're out in public, say you're down on Fountain Square, which is a public square, and you see something happening, you can record that without getting anyone's consent, and that's fine. But if it's happening on private property, or if it's happening in a place where someone might have an interest in privacy, you have to get one party's consent before the actual document could be disseminated in public. That's a law. So the best way to do that, especially if you're trying to record a law enforcement interaction with an immigrant, ask the immigrant. Don't ask the law enforcement officer, because they're not going to give you permission, but ask the immigrant. And then law enforcement does not, again, don't give them permission to search anything. They don't have a right to look at your phone. They don't have a right to delete anything off of your phone. You have a right to record that interaction, okay? All right, so now we're going to watch this really cool video about a man who knew his rights, knew what rights to enforce, and used them when ICE stopped him. So not local police, not state police. This is Immigration Customs Enforcement. This is the federal government's police branch of immigration law.
It's a Department of Homeland Security order. It's a warrant. Okay. No, it's not a warrant. It's not a warrant under the Constitution of the United States. Warrant of arrest of alien. Yeah, warrant of arrest of alien not signed by a judge. It's not a judicial warrant. I have no obligation to abide by that warrant.
Brian McCormick, I'm not sure if everyone can read. He was pulled over with 2 undocumented immigrants in his car. ICE agents attempted to detain McCormick's passengers who were in the car.
It's a lawful warrant signed by a judge of the Immigration and Nationality Act, and an official designated with that authority. Are you hearing this, Mark?
He called his attorney.
Our attorney's on his way. Okay. What's that? That's not a warrant. No, it's not. It's a Department of Homeland Security order. It's a warrant. Okay. No, it's not a warrant. It's not a warrant under the Constitution of the United States. It's a warrant under the Immigration and Nationality Act of the United States. Okay, that's fine, but it's not under the Constitution. You have no jurisdiction over me as a citizen. I'm the driver of this vehicle.
An ICE warrant directs various federal immigration enforcement agents to arrest the person named in the warrant. Because it's not issued by a judge, an ICE warrant does not give the immigration enforcement officer the authority to demand entry into a home or private space in order to make the arrest. That's from the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. McCormick said ICE tried to intimidate him into complying.
Okay, are you familiar with Section 1324 of the U.S. Code?
It's the Immigration Nationality Act.
I'm studying to be a Department of Justice accredited representative, so I've been through training. And I have copies of actually in this box right here, I have a copy of the real warrant and a copy of that, just so people know not to listen to that.
Smart.
Transporting and harboring illegal aliens in the United States. I am. Okay.
ICE tried to intimidate me into relinquishing my rights, and I upheld my unwavering defense of our community. That's Brian McCormick. ICE officers eventually left the scene without making any arrest. Yay! An individual interfered with the enforcement action, causing officers to instead depart the scene to avoid further disruption because they didn't have any right to do it. That was law enforcement. McCormick was accompanying the 2 immigrants to court for traffic-related offenses on the morning of the incident. He says he was pulled over after leaving court. ICE has increasingly used courthouse arrests, especially in New York, where this happened. One study found a 1,700% increase of these arrests in New York from 2016 to 2018, just 2 years.
Meet Mia.
Nah,
Mia's big
Mia,
on
we don't
volume,
care.
But not on wasting time to get it. She knows.
Sorry. All right, so like Brian McCormick said, warrants issued by Immigration and Customs Enforcement are signed off by immigration officers and immigration judges. All of these people fall under the first branch of government, the executive branch. Under the Constitution, in order for law enforcement to infringe upon an individual's rights, they have to have probable cause and a warrant signed off by a judge, a third branch of government, judicial judge. And so what happened, essentially, is that ICE pulled this guy over, said, I've got a warrant for an arrest. The warrant was issued by an immigration officer, which meant that that was not a valid warrant to infringe upon someone's rights, including Brian, who was driving the car. And Brian did the right thing. He said, you know, I'm admitting to you, I have these people in my car with me. You want them, I'm not going to give them to you. You can't infringe upon my rights as a U.S. citizen. And so law enforcement had no option because they couldn't do anything, right? They had to leave. And these two people that were being transported by Brian were saved from being arrested by ICE. Yeah?
They got out of the car and they were no longer in Brian's property, Brian is a citizen. What would their position then have been faced with that same gun?
So if those people were out in the community, very often this happens. People will be at home and ICE will come to the door and say, let me in, let me in. They say no, because I don't have to let you in. The next day when they leave or they're going off to work, ICE arrests them then. So if ICE does encounter you in the public, on a non-private property, then they can arrest you. Yes?
Do places like Sukasa try to get that information across to?
Yeah, the question was, do places like Sukasa try to get that information across? That's actually what I do. Yeah. Like I said, I do Know Your Rights presentations to immigrant communities, and I've developed from that presentation this kind of general Know Your Rights for non-immigrant communities that want to act as advocates or liaisons or allies with the immigrant community. But yes, we do. Yeah. And we are at the end. We made it. Thank you all for sticking with me.